Eloan had imagined her wedding day 1,000 times as a girl. She had pictured wildflowers in her hair, and a dress that actually fit, and a groom who looked at her like she was the only woman alive. She had not pictured the Alpha King standing 6 feet behind her while she tried to say her vows. But life, as it turned out, had a terrible sense of humor. The morning had started beautifully. The Thornwood Pack's gathering hall had been scrubbed and decorated with pine boughs and white ribbon. Aldrich stood across from her at the altar, looking handsome and steady and safe. He smiled at her the way he always did, warm, predictable, kind. Eloan smiled back and tried to ignore the knot in her stomach that had been tightening since dawn. This was the right decision. Aldrich was a good man, a Beto with solid standing in the pack. He would give her a home, a name, a place. She had spent 23 years without any of those things, and she was tired of waiting for something that might never come. The officiant cleared his throat and opened the Book of Rites. Eloan smoothed her hands over the borrowed dress and focused on breathing. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's perfume. She had pinned her dark auburn hair up with wildflowers, because she could not afford a proper veil, and the dress hung loose on her narrow frame, made for a woman with broader hips and a fuller figure. She had stared at herself in the mirror that morning and thought she looked like a girl playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Except she had never had a mother. We gathered today in the sight of the old wolves and the new to bind these two souls in the promise of the pack. The officiant began. Eloan's fingers trembled. She folded them together and squeezed until the shaking stopped. Aldrich noticed. He always noticed the small things. He reached across the narrow space between them and brushed his thumb over her knuckles. A reassuring gesture, a kind one. She felt nothing. The officiant continued. The words washed over her like water over river stones, familiar and smooth and impossible to hold on to. She caught fragments. Honor, duty, devotion. The shape of a life she was choosing because the alternative was no life at all. Then the air changed. It happened between one breath and the next. A pressure settled over the room like a storm front, rolling in, heavy and electric and wrong. The hairs on Eloan's arms stood on end. Her wolf, a quiet thing that had never once given her trouble, suddenly lurched beneath her skin, with such force that she gasped. Aldrich frowned. Eloan, are you all right? She opened her mouth to answer, but the officiant had stopped speaking. The old man's face had gone white. He was staring at something behind her, his lips parted, the Book of Rites trembling in his hands. Eloan became aware of the silence. Not quiet, silence. The absolute suffocating absence of sound that only happens when every living creature in a room stops breathing at the same time. 200 guests. Not a whisper, not a rustle. Nothing, and behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of a body that was not Aldrich's, someone was standing. Her wolf went still, not calm. Still, the way a rabbit goes still when a hawk's shadow passes overhead. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her not to turn around. She turned around. The man standing behind her was the largest person she had ever seen. He filled the aisle the way a boulder fills a riverbed, immovable and absolute. His shoulders were broad enough to block the light from the open doors behind him, casting his face in shadow. But his eyes were not in shadow, his eyes burned. A deep, molten amber that had no business being in a human face, because those were Wolf's eyes, fully shifted, blazing with an intensity that made her legs go weak. He was staring at her. Not at the officiant, not at Aldrich, not at the 200 frozen guests. At her, only her. With an expression she could not name because it contained too many things at once. Hunger, shock, fury. And beneath all of it, something desperate and raw that made her throat tighten for reasons she did not understand. 2 soldiers flanked him. They wore the black and silver of the Crown Guard, and they looked terrified, not of the crowd. Of him, that is the king, someone whispered. The whisper broke the silence like a stone through glass, and suddenly the hall erupted. Chairs scraped, women gasped, men rose to their feet. Aldrich stepped in front of Elowen on instinct, his body angling to shield her. The king's gaze snapped to Aldrich, and the growl that came out of him was not a sound a man should be able to make. It was low and deep and vibrated through the floor. Elowen felt it in her teeth, in her ribs, in the base of her spine. Every wolf in the room flinched. Aldrich went pale but held his ground. Elowen grabbed his arm without thinking. "Don't move," she breathed. She could not explain why she said it. She could not explain how she knew that moving would be the worst possible thing Aldrich could do right now. But she knew it the way, she knew how to breathe. And Aldrich, to his credit, listened. The king's gaze shifted back to her. The growl died. And then, something impossible happened. The amber in his eyes flickered. The wolf receded, just a fraction, just enough for her to see the man beneath it. He blinked. Once, twice, like someone waking from a dream they could not escape. His lips parted. "Mine," he said. The word was barely a whisper, raw and broken and involuntary. He said it the way a drowning man says air. Not a command, not a claim, a recognition. Then, his beta was there. A tall, sharp-featured man with pale eyes who moved between the king and the altar, with the practiced calm of someone who had done this before. "Apologies for the interruption," the beta said, his voice perfectly level. "The king requires a word with the bride, in private." Elowen looked at him in disbelief. "I am in the middle of getting married." The beta looked at her. Then he looked at the king, whose eyes had not left her face, whose hands were clenched into fists at his sides, whose entire body vibrated with the effort of standing still. "Yes," the beta said, "I can see that." He paused. The hall erupted into chaos. The room they put her in was small, cold, and smelled of dust. A storage room off the main hall, cleared hastily. Someone had dragged in a chair and a candle. The candle was unlit. Elowen sat in the dark and tried to understand what had just happened. The Alpha King was here, in Thornwood. At her wedding. The Alpha King, whose name was spoken in whispers across every territory, because the stories that followed it were the kind that made grown wolves lose sleep. King Theron Viel, the fractured crown, the man whose wolf had been consuming him for over a year. The man who had burned through healers and shamans and mystics from every corner of the realm, and none of them could fix what was broken inside him. And he had looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had stopped asking. The door opened. The beta stepped inside. He was calmer than any person had a right to be, given the circumstances. "My name is Soren," he said. "I serve as the king's second." "Wonderful," Elowen replied. "Am I being arrested?" Soren's mouth twitched. "No, then can I go back to my wedding?" The pause that followed was just long enough to make her stomach drop. "There are some things you need to understand first," Soren said. Spud. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, arms folded, as though he expected her to bolt. Which was fair because she was considering it. "The king has a condition," Soren began carefully. "His wolf and his human consciousness are at war. They have been for more than 14 months. The wolf is winning." Elowen's breath caught. "The rumors are true, then." "The rumors don't cover half of it," Soren said, his voice dropping lower. "He loses control. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. The episodes are getting longer and more frequent. The best healers in the realm cannot stop it." He paused, watching her face. "In approximately 6 months, the wolf will take him permanently. The man you saw in that hall will cease to exist." Elowen felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard the whispers. Everyone had. But hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud in a dusty storage room while her wedding guests waited in the hall, was something else entirely. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because when the king walked into this hall, his wolf went quiet for the first time in 14 months. Soren, let that land. Whatever you are to him, whatever you did." "I didn't do anything," Elowen said, her voice rising. "I was standing at an altar. I was getting married. I did not ask for this." "No one is suggesting you did," Soren replied calmly. "But the king's wolf responded to your presence in a way we have never seen it respond to anything. Not medicine, not magic, Not force. What are you asking me? Elowen demanded. Soren looked at her for a long moment. I am asking you to sit in a room with him. That is all. 15 minutes. Let us see if the effect holds. And my wedding will wait. Aldrich will wait? Soren's expression shifted, something almost like sympathy flickering across his sharp features. Miss Ashford, if what happened in that hall is what I think it is, then I am afraid the question of your wedding has become considerably more complicated. Elowen opened her mouth to argue, to refuse, to say something fierce and certain, but the words dried up in her throat, because beneath her skin, her wolf was pressing forward. Not in fear, not in agitation, in recognition, and it terrified her more than anything the beta had said. 15 minutes, she said. Not a second more. The walk to the room where they were keeping the king felt like crossing a frozen lake, each step, careful and deliberate, and shadowed by the certainty that the ground beneath her could crack at any moment. 2 guards stood outside a heavy wooden door. They looked at Elowen with the kind of expression people reserve for someone walking willingly into a burning building. Soren opened the door. The room was larger than the one she had been held in, but it felt smaller because Theronvale was inside it. He stood by the window, with his back to the door, and his hands braced against the stone sill. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room, coiled and rigid, like a man holding himself together by sheer will. He did not turn when the door opened. He gave no sign of acknowledging Soren. But Elowen saw the exact moment he registered her presence because his hands tightened on the sill until his knuckles went white, and a long, shuddering breath left his body. His wolf's eyes were gone. The amber had receded. When he finally turned his head just slightly, she caught a glimpse of dark gray eyes, human eyes, and the raw, bone-deep exhaustion in them made something behind her ribs pull tight. Soren guided her to a chair against the far wall. Sit, he murmured. Just sit. She sat. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The king said nothing. He turned back to the window and stared out at the tree line. Minutes passed. Elowen counted them the way she counted heartbeats when a patient was crashing, precise and desperate. At the 7-minute mark, she noticed his grip on the windowsill had loosened. At 10 minutes, his shoulders dropped a fraction. At 12, his breathing changed from controlled and deliberate to something slower, something that sounded almost natural. He was calming down. Whatever storm raged inside him was quieting, and all she was doing was sitting in a chair on the other side of the room. At exactly 15 minutes, Soren stepped forward. Time, Miss Ashford. Elowen stood. Her legs were unsteady. She moved toward the door, and as she passed the midpoint of the room, the king spoke. What is your name? His voice was lower than she had expected, rougher, like something that had been scraped raw and was only just beginning to heal. She stopped. She should not have stopped. Elowen, she said without turning around. Elowen Ashford, she heard him exhale, a slow, careful breath that sounded like the first one he had taken in a very long time. Lowen, he repeated, and the sound of her name in his mouth did something to her that she was absolutely not prepared to examine. She left. She made it exactly 4 steps down the corridor before Soren caught up with her. The wolf is already returning, he said quietly. It started the moment you left the room. Elowen closed her eyes. Of course it did. The wedding did not happen. Elowen stood in the small chamber off the hall where she had dressed that morning and watched Aldrich process the news with the quiet dignity she had always admired about him and now felt she did not deserve. The king's second says I am needed at the palace, she said. The words tasted wrong in her mouth. For how long? Aldrich asked. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. I don't know. And you're going. Elowen swallowed. I don't have a choice. He is the king. There is always a choice, Elowen. She looked at him then, really looked. And the guilt that flooded through her was so sharp it stole her breath. This was a good man. A man who had chosen her when no one else had. A man who had offered her a name and a home and a future. And she was walking away from him because a stranger's wolf had gone quiet in her presence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," Aldrich said. He stepped forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, gentle and final. "Come back if you can," she wanted to promise she would. She wanted to say, "Of course," or "This is temporary," or "Nothing will change." But the words would not form, and she realized with a sickening lurch that some part of her, some deep and treacherous part, did not want to make that promise. She left Thornwood that afternoon in a Crown Guard carriage. Her wedding dress was folded in a trunk she never asked for. She wore traveling clothes that did not belong to her, and stared out the window and tried not to think about the look on Aldrich's face when she walked away. The palace was enormous, the kind of enormous that made a person feel like an insect, small and temporary and crushable. Towers of dark stone rose against a gray sky, and the courtyard alone was larger than the entire Thornwood gathering hall. Soren met her at the gate. "Your quarters are in the East Wing," he said, leading her through corridors that seemed designed to make a person feel lost. "The king's chambers are in the North Tower. You will not be required to enter them." Eloin blinked. "Then where exactly am I supposed to sit with him?" "His study, the council room, the training yard, if necessary." Soren glanced at her. "Wherever the king happens to be when the wolf begins to surface." "So I'm a walking sedative," Eloin said flatly. "An extraordinarily valuable one," Soren replied. Without a hint of irony, they stopped outside a door. "This will be your room. Settle in. Someone will bring supper. The king has a council session at dawn, and you will be present." Eloin blinked. "At dawn? In a council session? Is that a problem? I am a healer's apprentice from a border pack. What am I supposed to do in a council session?" Soren considered this. Sit quietly and prevent the king from dismantling his advisory board. He paused. "Literally, last month he threw Councillor Verith through a window during an episode." "Through a window," Eloin repeated. "A closed one," Soren confirmed. "Councillor Verith survived, but he has developed a strong preference for ground floor meetings." Eloin opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What floor is the council chamber on? Third?" Of course it is that night. Alone in a room larger than any she had slept in before, Eloin stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day. 8 hours ago she had been standing at an altar, about to marry a man who loved her. Now she was in the Alpha King's palace, summoned because her mere presence calmed the beast that was slowly devouring him from the inside. Her wolf stirred restlessly, pressing against her ribs like it was searching for something. "Stop it," Eloin muttered. "You have never once had an opinion about anything, and I would appreciate it if you kept that streak alive." The wolf ignored her. Dawn came too quickly. A guard escorted her through a labyrinth of corridors to the council chamber, a long, high-ceilinged room with tall windows that let in weak morning light. A heavy oak table ran the length of the room. 8 men sat around it, each one radiating the particular brand of self-importance that came with advising a king. Every single one of them stared at her when she entered. Soren was already there. He gestured to a chair against the wall, behind the king's seat. Here Eloin sat. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to look like she belonged, which was difficult given that she was wearing a dress 2 sizes too large and had slept approximately 40 minutes. The door opened. The room went taut. King Theron Vael entered the council chamber like a thunderstorm entering a glass house. His presence was a physical force, a pressure that pushed against the walls and made the air feel thinner. He was dressed in black, and the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had slept even less than she had. He crossed to the head of the table without looking at anyone, pulled out his chair, and sat. Then he went very still. Eloin watched the back of his head and saw the exact moment the tension left his neck. A slight loosening, barely perceptible, like a fist slowly unclenching. He knew she was there. He could feel her the same way. She could feel him. That impossible awareness, that had no name and no explanation and absolutely no right to exist between 2 people who had met less than a day ago. The council session began. Aloan understood perhaps a third of what was discussed. Troop movements, tax disputes, something about a territorial claim in the southern marshes. She sat behind the king and watched the room and noticed things. She noticed that the counselors flinched every time the king moved too quickly. She noticed that two of them had positioned their chairs slightly farther from the table than the others, giving themselves a clear path to the door. She noticed the fresh plaster on the wall to her left, roughly at the height a man's body would hit if thrown from a seated position, the window Soren had mentioned. She shuddered. 40 minutes into the session, one of the counselors raised his voice during an argument about grain levies. It was not a shout, it was barely above speaking volume. But the king's hand, resting on the table, curled into a fist. Eloin's breath caught. She saw it happen in real time. The gray of his eyes flickered, a flash of amber, hot and inhuman, surfacing like something breaking through ice. The counselor kept talking. He did not see it, but Soren did. The beta's gaze locked onto Eloin with an urgency that needed no words. She did not think. She leaned forward in her chair just slightly and placed her hand on the back of the king's chair, not on him. On the wood behind his shoulder, close enough that he would feel the warmth of her hand, close enough that her scent would reach him. The amber flickered again, wavered, and slowly, like a flame being starved of air, it went out. The king's fist unclenched, his breathing evened. The counselor finished his argument, oblivious to how close he had just come to following Counselor Verith out a window. After the session, the counselors filed out. Eloin moved to leave, but the king's voice stopped her. "You were behind me," he said, not turning around. "Yes," Eloin replied a pause. "I felt the wolf retreating. I have not felt that in a very long time." She did not know what to say to that. The weight of it was too large for words. The counselor with the loud voice, Theron continued. Was he the one arguing about grain? Yes, I was about to lose control. It was not a question. It was a confession, stripped bare, and offered, without defense. "I know," Eloin said softly. He turned then, and she saw his face fully, for the first time, in proper light. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with sharp features and dark hair, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. But his eyes were what held her. Gray and deep, and filled with such profound weariness that she felt an answering ache settle into her bones. "You should not have come here," he said. "You did not give me much of a choice, Your Majesty." Something crossed his face. Not quite a flinch, not quite shame. Something heavier. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose I did not." He stood and left the room, without another word. Eloin sat in the empty council chamber, her gaze fixed on the plastered wall where a man had been thrown through glass, and she thought about the look in the king's eyes when he admitted he had almost lost control. Not anger, not frustration, fear. He was afraid of himself, and she was the only thing standing between him and the monster he was becoming. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, her wolf pressed forward again, urgent and restless, and Eloin felt something far more dangerous than fear settle behind her sternum. She felt needed. A rhythm formed over the following days, fragile and strange, and unlike anything Eloin had experienced before. In the mornings, she sat behind the king during council sessions. In the afternoons, she was allowed to work in the palace infirmary under the supervision of Mistress Briony, the head healer, a sharp-tongued woman with silver-streaked hair and the unsettling ability to diagnose a patient from across the room. In the evenings, she sat in the king's study while he worked through correspondence, always nearby, never quite with him, close enough to keep the wolf quiet, far enough to pretend this was professional. The king did not speak to her during these hours, not at first. He worked in silence, his pen scratching across parchment, his breathing steady and controlled. She sat in her designated chair and read whatever books she could find, and tried not to stare at the way the firelight caught the angles of his jaw. She failed at not staring, more often than she would ever admit. The changes came in increments so small She almost missed them. A cushion appeared on her chair one morning, thick and soft, replacing the bare wood she had been sitting on for a week. The next day, a tea service was set on the side table nearest her seat, still steaming when she arrived, brewed with chamomile and lemon balm, her preferred blend. She could not remember mentioning it to anyone, which meant someone had been paying attention. She had a suspicion about who. On the fourth evening, Theron looked up from his desk and said, without preamble, "You hum when you read." Eloin froze mid-page. "I do not." "You do." The same three notes, repeating. "You have been doing it for the past 20 minutes." Heat flooded her face. "I am deeply sorry, Your Majesty. I did not ask you to stop." He returned to his correspondence, like the exchange had never happened. Eloin watched the top of his dark head and felt her pulse do something entirely unnecessary. The silence between them shifted after that night. It became less like the silence of strangers forced into proximity, and more like the silence of two people who had simply run out of the need to fill every moment with sound. Comfortable, if she was being honest. Warm. He began asking her questions. Small ones, tossed out between documents like afterthoughts. Where had she trained as a healer? What herbs grew in Thornwood that did not grow here? Whether she preferred the mountains or the coast. The questions came at odd intervals, sometimes 3 in an evening, sometimes none, for 2 days, as if he was rationing his curiosity. "I have never seen the coast," she admitted one evening, looking up from a text on wound irrigation. He looked up at that, something flickering in his gray eyes. "Never. Thornwood is landlocked. I have never been more than a day's ride from where I was born, which is embarrassing to say out loud, now that I hear it." He was quiet for a moment. "The coast is loud," he said finally. "The waves never stop. The wind carries salt and noise, and the smell of things that live in the deep. Some people find it unsettling." "Do you?" "No." A pause. "I find it honest. The ocean does not pretend to be calm when it is not." Eloin studied his face in the firelight, and thought she understood what he meant. One morning, she arrived at the study to find a small leather-bound volume on her chair, a traveler's account of the northern coastline, illustrated with detailed ink drawings of cliffs and harbors and fishing villages. There was no note, no explanation. She looked at Theron, who was already at his desk reading reports, and his ears turned faintly red. She never mentioned the book. She read it cover to cover in 2 evenings. She kept it on her bedside table and traced the ink drawing of a harbor town at night, and wondered what it would feel like to hear waves. On the 7th night, the wolf broke through. Eloin was in the study reading, when Theron's pen clattered to the desk. She looked up and saw the amber flooding his eyes, hot and wild, swallowing the gray, like fire swallowing paper. His hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood groaned beneath them. "Get back," he growled. His voice was doubled, the man and the wolf speaking at once, a terrible layered sound that vibrated in her sternum. But Eloin did not get back. She stood and crossed the room, because every instinct she had was screaming at her to get closer, not farther, and before she could think better of it, she grabbed his hand. The world disappeared. She was inside something vast and dark and furious. It was not a place, it was a presence. The wolf's consciousness, raw and unfiltered, and it crashed over her like a wave of boiling water. Her own awareness shrank to a pinpoint, drowning in sensation that was not hers. She felt his rage, not anger, rage. The kind that has no target and no end, the kind that eats everything it touches and is still starving. And beneath it, tangled into the fury, like roots through rock, she felt his memories. A battlefield choked with smoke so thick it blotted out the sun, screaming that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A woman's face she did not recognize, frozen in surprise, falling, hands covered in blood, his hands, his own voice, breaking apart under the weight of what he was seeing. Hold the line, hold the line. And deeper still, beneath the memories, beneath the rage, she felt something she did not expect. The wolf was afraid. Not angry, not hunting, not dominant, Afraid. It thrashed inside the cage of the curse, like a trapped animal slamming against walls it could not see, howling in a register that Eloan felt in her bones rather than heard. The bond between man and beast was shredding like cloth, fiber by fiber, and the wolf was terrified of the dark that waited on the other side of that last thread. Then, someone was shaking her. "Miss Ashford! Miss Ashford! Can you hear me?" Eloan gasped. She was on the floor of the study, her cheek pressed against cold stone. Soren knelt over her, his pale eyes sharp with concern. Her hand was no longer touching the king. Theron stood across the room, his back pressed flat against the wall, his chest heaving. The amber was gone from his eyes. He was staring at her with an expression of absolute horror. "What did you see?" he demanded. Lowen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She was shaking so violently, her teeth chattered. Her body felt like it had been turned inside out and wrung dry. "What did you see?" he repeated, louder. "Everything," she whispered. The silence that followed was the heaviest she had ever felt. "The wolf is not trying to take over," Eloan said, still on the floor, still trembling. She pushed herself upright and looked at him directly. "It is being torn away from you. It is terrified, Theron. Your wolf is as frightened as you are." The king flinched at the sound of his name from her lips. Something in his expression cracked just for a moment, and she saw the man beneath the crown. Lost and desperate, and so exhausted by the war inside his own body that he could barely stand. Then the crack sealed shut. He turned to Soren, his voice flat and final. "She does not touch me again. Not under any circumstances. Is that clear?" He left the room. The door slammed behind him, hard enough to rattle the hinges. Eloan sat on the cold floor and pressed her hands to her face and tried to stop shaking. Soren crouched beside her. He said nothing for a long moment. "Can you stand?" he asked finally. "Give me a minute," she said into her palms. "Take as many as you need." She took 7. None of them helped. She told Brienne everything. The head healer listened without interruption, her hands busy sorting dried yarrow root into glass jars, her expression betraying nothing, until Eloan finished speaking. Then she set down the yarrow and looked at Eloan with the kind of gaze that made patients confess things they had been hiding for years. "You entered the wolf's consciousness," Brienne said. "Not a question. I think so, yes. It was not like a dream. It was not like a vision. It was real. I could feel everything he felt. His emotions, his memories, the wolf's terror. All of it. And the wolf was afraid. Terrified," Eloan confirmed. "It is not trying to destroy him, Brienne. It is being ripped away from him. The curse is not strengthening the wolf and weakening the man. It is severing the bond between them entirely." Brienne was quiet for a long moment. She crossed the infirmary to a shelf lined with leather-bound texts, older than the palace itself, and pulled down a volume so ancient, the spine crackled when she opened it. Dust rose from the pages in a thin cloud. "King Theron went to war against a rogue faction called the Ashen Maw over 2 years ago," Brienne said, her finger tracing down a page of faded script. "Their leader, a man named Drekkan, had been raiding border settlements for months, burning villages, killing families. The king tried diplomacy first, sent emissaries, offered territory concessions. Every offer was rejected. War followed." Eloan nodded. She had heard the broad strokes. Everyone had. The Ashen Maw War was the defining event of Theron's reign, the campaign that earned him his reputation, and the thing no one spoke about in his presence. "What the public does not know," Brienne continued, "is that Drekkan's mate was a shaman named Visara, a powerful one, old bloodline, the kind of power that comes from places healers like us do not go." She paused, reading carefully. "The accepted account says that after Drekkan fell in battle, Visara held his body in the ash of their burning settlement and cursed King Theron with her last breath. That is what the court records claim." Brienne read from the text, translating the old script slowly. "The words of the curse are documented," she said. "The beast will devour the man will lose the beast. And, when the last thread between them snaps, neither will survive. Eloin felt cold creep through her veins. So the curse fractures the soul bond between a shifter and his wolf? Precisely, Brienne said. In most wolves, this bond is so fundamental it cannot be touched. It is like trying to separate water from wet. But Vasara found a way, a slow, grinding severing that takes months, maybe years, but is ultimately irreversible. She closed the book with a heavy finality. Or, so the texts suggest. How long does he have? Eloin asked. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Before you arrived, I estimated 4 months, perhaps 5. The episodes were accelerating. Each one severed more of the connection. There were days when the wolf surfaced and Theron could not find his way back for hours. And now, since I have been here, your presence slows it dramatically. Your scent, your proximity, whatever it is about you, it eases the fracture temporarily. The wolf calms because it recognizes you as something essential. As what? As its anchor, Brienne said. Then she corrected herself gently but firmly. As its mate, the wolf knows what you are to him, Eloin, even if neither of you has accepted it yet. Eloin's stomach dropped. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her own heartbeat, rapid and uneven. But when I touched him and went inside, I felt the rage. All of it. Every memory, every emotion, every piece of the wolf's pain. And when I came out, I was shaking. For an hour, Brianni's expression turned grave. That is what concerns me. You are not just calming the wolf, you are absorbing the fracture. The wolf's pain, his memories, his fury. Each time you enter that space, you take some of it into yourself. What does that mean? What happens to me? Brienne set down the book and turned to face her fully. The curse was designed for one host, one mind, one wolf, one fracture. If you keep reaching into his consciousness, the curse may begin to treat you as a second target. It will not distinguish between his pain and yours. It will simply spread. The words settled over Eloin, like earth over a coffin. She sat in the infirmary chair and stared at a crack in the stone wall and tried to process what she had just been told. That night, alone in her quarters, she noticed it for the first time. She was sitting at the small vanity, brushing her auburn hair before bed, her mind still turning over Brienne's warning, when a flash of rage surged through her so suddenly she knocked the brush from her hand. It clattered to the floor. The rage was not hers. It was his. She could taste it at the back of her throat, metallic and burning, flooding her senses for 3 terrible seconds before it vanished as abruptly as it had arrived. Eloin stared at her reflection in the small mirror. Her eyes were brown. Her eyes had always been brown. But for just a moment, just a flicker so fast, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. She could have sworn she saw amber. Over the following days, it got worse. She became snappish in the infirmary, losing patience with tasks that had never bothered her. Before, she dropped a mortar and shouted a word that made Brienne raise both eyebrows. Her hands trembled when she worked with delicate tinctures, and she cut herself twice preparing salves, because her focus kept fracturing into moments of white-hot fury that did not belong to her. She felt hot all the time, like something was burning just beneath her skin, and the pull toward Theron intensified. It was no longer a gentle tug, no longer a quiet awareness she could push to the back of her mind. It was a need. A gravitational force that made her chest ache when she was more than a room away from him, and when she was near him, the ache transformed into something worse. A hunger for contact that she could barely contain. She found herself leaning toward him in council sessions, catching herself, reaching for his sleeve when he passed. He noticed. Of course he noticed. The man was fractured, but he was not blind. "You are not sleeping," Theron said one morning in the study. His voice was flat, but his gray eyes tracked her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "I am fine, Your Majesty." "You are lying." He set down his pen. "Your hands are shaking." Eloin shoved her hands beneath the book in her lap. "It is cold in here. It is the warmest room in the palace. The fire has been stoked twice since you arrived." He leaned forward in his chair, studying her the way she imagined he studied battle maps, looking for the weakness, the fracture point, the thing that would break first. Your scent has changed. It is sharper than it was, hotter, like iron held too close to flame. His jaw tightened. What happened when you touched me, Aloan? What did it do to you? Nothing. I cannot handle. That is not what I asked. She met his gaze and felt the pull so strongly, it took physical effort not to stand and close the distance between them. I saw the wolf, she admitted finally. I felt what it feels, the rage, the fear, the separation. And now sometimes I feel it when I am awake. Echoes of it, flashes. The blood drained from his face. She watched it happen in real time. The color receding, the horror settling in. How often? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A few times a day, sometimes more. Theron stood so abruptly, his chair scraped back against the stone floor, with a sound like a blade being drawn. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped directly in front of her, looking down at her with an expression that was equal parts fury and devastation. Why did you not tell me? Because you would do exactly what you are about to do, Eloin said quietly. His jaw clenched so hard, she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. I would have told you eventually, she added. I was trying to find a solution first. I was trying to understand it before you shut me out. There is no solution, he said, his voice raw and scraped bare. This is what I was afraid of. My wolf, my curse. It is spreading to you. I am infecting you with the thing that is killing me. You are not a disease, Theron. You don't know what I am. He stared at her, and the anguish in his gray eyes was so naked it made her want to weep. You don't know what the wolf has made me do. They stood inches apart, and the air between them was so charged, she could feel it humming against her skin like a living thing. His eyes dropped to her mouth for one unguarded second, and she saw the want there, naked and desperate and burning, before he crushed it down and sealed it away behind the mask he wore for everyone. You need to leave, he said. No, Eloin said. The word hung in the air between them. Small and defiant and absolute. Theron's expression hardened into something she had not seen before. Not anger. Resolve. The terrible kind of resolve that a man finds when he has decided to cut away the only thing keeping him alive because he believes the cost of keeping it is too high. This is not a discussion, he said. You are right. It is not. 'Cause I am not leaving. He stepped back from her, putting distance between them like distance was a weapon he could wield. You felt the wolf's rage. You told me yourself. It is leaking into you. Your scent is changing. Your eyes are changing. You are losing control of things that should be yours to control. If you stay here and this continues, you will be consumed by it the same way I am being consumed. And if I leave, you will be consumed by it alone. Aloan shot back. Within months, according to Brienne, the wolf will fracture completely from you. The man I am looking at right now will cease to exist, and there will be nothing left but a feral beast in a king's body. That is my burden to carry, not yours. It stopped being just your burden when your wolf recognized me as its mate. The word landed like a physical blow. Theron flinched. Actually flinched, his whole body jerking backward as though she had struck him across the face. Don't, he said. Don't what? Don't tell the truth. Don't say that word. His voice was hoarse, stripped raw. Because if what you are suggesting is real, if this bond is what you and Brienne and Soren all seem to believe it is, then keeping you here is the cruelest thing I could possibly do. I am a fractured man with a dying wolf, and every moment you spend near me, you break a little more. That is not a mating bond, Aloan. That is a death sentence, and I will not sign it. Her eyes burned. She blinked hard, and refused to let the tears fall, because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent her entire life reading people in order to survive, that if she cried, he would use her pain as proof that he was right. So your plan, she said, her voice tight and controlled, is to send me away. Let the fracture finish what it started. Die alone in this palace, surrounded by counselors who are afraid to sit too close to you. While I sit in Thornwood feeling you disappear through a bond I never asked for and cannot sever. That is your brilliant strategy." Theron said nothing. His silence was an answer, and it was the worst answer she had ever received. "Do you have any idea what that would feel like?" she demanded, stepping toward him. He stepped back. She followed. "Feeling someone die through a mate bond. Do you know what that does to the surviving wolf? Because I have treated women in the infirmary who lost their mates, and they do not recover, Theron. They do not move on. They do not find someone else. They fade. The bond is incomplete," he said. She could hear the desperation now, the fraying edges of his composure. "It has not been sealed. If you leave now, you can recover. The connection will weaken over time. You can go back to your healer's work, have a life. Find someone who will not destroy you by existing. Go back to Aldrich, you mean." Something dark and possessive flashed across his face before he smothered it. His wolf surged behind his eyes, amber flickering through the gray, and she watched him fight it down with the practiced brutality of a man who had been waging this internal war since the day the curse took hold. "If that is what you choose," he ground out, "you cannot even say it without your wolf trying to surface," Eloin said, and her voice cracked on the last word, despite every effort to hold it together. "You can feel the bond as strongly as I can, probably stronger, and you are standing there, telling me to leave this palace and go marry another man. Do you hear yourself?" "I hear a king making a decision that protects the people he is responsible for," Theron growled. The sound was low and resonant, and it vibrated through the floor beneath her feet. "And right now, whether you accept it or not, that includes you. I am not your subject," Eloin said. "I am your mate. You are not my mate," he roared. The sound cracked through the study like a whip. The windows shuddered in their frames. A glass on the side table vibrated and toppled, shattering against the floor in a burst of crystal. The echo rang off the stone walls and faded into a silence so thick it pressed against her skin like wet cloth. Eloin flinched. The tears she had been holding back broke free, hot and furious, streaming down her cheeks. She wiped them away with the back of her hand and glared at him through the blur. She would not look away. She would not give him that. "You're a coward," she whispered. The word hit him harder than the roar had hit her. She watched it land, watched the impact ripple through his body like a stone dropped into still water, watched something deep and fundamental in his expression shatter and not reassemble. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but I would rather be a living coward than your executioner." He turned away from her and crossed to the window. His hands braced against the stone sill, the same position she had found him in the very first time she entered his rooms. The same tension in his shoulders, the same rigid, desperate control, holding him upright by nothing more than habit and stubbornness. "A carriage will be prepared at dawn," he said, without turning around. "Soren will arrange an escort back to Thornwood. You will be compensated for your time here." Compensated. The word was a knife slipped between her ribs, like she had been hired. Like the past weeks had been a transaction, a service rendered, a line item in the Crown's ledger, like the cushion on her chair and the book about the coast and the way he said her name meant nothing at all. "Theron, please," Eloin said, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how much it revealed. "Leave," he said, "before I lose what is left of my control and make this harder for both of us." She stood behind him in the silence of his study and watched his shoulders shake, not from cold, not from anger, from the effort of holding himself together while he tore the only good thing out of his life with his own hands. She wanted to cross the room. She wanted to put her arms around him and hold on until he stopped pretending he could survive this alone. She wanted to tell him that she was already broken, had been broken long before she met him, had been a girl without a name or a family or a place in the world, and that the weeks she had spent sitting in his study, listening to his pen scratch across parchment while firelight played across his jaw, or the first time in her 23 years she had felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But he had turned to stone, and stones do not listen. Eloan left the study. The door clicked shut behind her, with a soft, final sound that was somehow worse than any slam could have been. A slam would have been an emotion. The click was a decision. She made it halfway down the corridor before her legs gave out. She sank against the wall and pressed her face into her hands, and cried with the silent, practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned very young that no one comes when you make noise. When she finally looked up, Soren was standing at the end of the corridor. How long he had been there, she did not know. His expression was unreadable, but something in his pale eyes looked almost like conflict. Almost like grief. "The carriage," she said, her voice hollow. "Dawn?" Soren regarded her for a long moment. He opened his mouth as though to say something, then closed it, then opened it again. "Dawn?" he confirmed. Eloan nodded and pulled herself to her feet. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She walked back to her quarters and packed the small bag she had brought from Thornwood. It did not take long. She had never accumulated much. A healer's habit, she supposed, traveling, light, carrying only what you could not bear to lose. She placed the borrowed dresses on the bed. She left the books on the shelf. She set the tea tin back on the table. She considered leaving the cushion, the thick, soft one that had appeared on her chair that first week, chosen specifically for her, but at the last moment she tucked it into her bag. Let him notice it was gone. Let him wonder. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room and pressed the cushion to her chest and felt his presence through the unfinished bond, like a hand reaching for her through deep water, distant, fading, desperate, still reaching. "Don't you dare die," she whispered into the dark. "Don't you dare." The carriage ride back to Thornwood took 2 days. Eloan spent both of them pressed against the window, watching the landscape blur past and feeling something inside her slowly tearing apart. It was not a metaphor. The bond, incomplete and unsealed and furious about it, pulled at her with every mile that passed between her and the palace. A physical ache that started behind her sternum and radiated outward until her entire body felt like a wound. By the second morning, she could barely eat. The bread the driver offered her tasted like ash. Water sat heavy in her stomach. Her hands shook so badly she could not hold a cup without spilling. And the flashes of amber came more frequently now, seizing her vision for a second or two before retreating. Each time, she felt a pulse of his emotion through the fraying bond. Rage, fear, exhaustion. And beneath it all, a grief so vast she could drown in it. He was getting worse. She could feel it. Thornwood looked exactly the same. The same timber houses, the same cobbled paths, the same gathering hall where she had stood in a borrowed dress and watched her life veer off course. Nothing had changed except her. Aldrich was waiting. Of course he was. Because Aldrich was good and patient and loyal, and those qualities had not disappeared just because she had. He stood in the doorway of his house, with his hands in his pockets, and his expression carefully arranged into something welcoming, and Eloan felt such a sharp stab of guilt that she nearly doubled over. "You look terrible," Aldrich said. "Thank you," Eloan managed. "It is wonderful to be home." He stepped aside to let her in. The house smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs and everything familiar, and she hated that it felt foreign, like a coat she had outgrown. "Are you staying?" Aldrich asked. No accusation in his voice. Just the question. "I think so," Eloan said. And the lie tasted worse than the ash bread. She tried. She really tried. She treated burns and set bones and mixed poultices. She sat across from Aldrich at dinner and made conversation and pretended her hands were not shaking. She smiled when neighbors asked about the palace, and she said the king had released her from service. And she did not mention the word mate to anyone, but her body was betraying her. The migraines started on the 3rd day. Blinding, crushing pressure behind her eyes that sent her to her knees in the middle of treating a patient. She blamed it on travel exhaustion. On the 4th day, she woke drenched in sweat, Her sheets twisted around her legs, with the taste of blood in her mouth and the echo of a howl ringing in her ears that no one else could hear. On the fifth day, she collapsed in the infirmary. Not a faint, a collapse. Her legs simply stopped working, and she went down hard, scattering bottles and bandages across the floor. The Thornwood healer, an older woman named Marin, knelt beside her and checked her pulse and her temperature and her eyes, and when she looked up, her expression was grim. "Your wolf is in distress," Marin said quietly. "Severe distress." "I have only seen this once before." "In who?" Eloin whispered from the floor. Marin hesitated. "A woman whose mate was dying 3 territories away." She felt every moment of it. The words hit Eloin like a closed fist. That night, alone in the dark, she felt the bond pulse once. A single faint throb of awareness, like a heartbeat at the very edge of hearing. He was still alive. But the pulse was weaker than yesterday, and yesterday it had been weaker than the day before. She pressed her hand to her chest and counted the seconds between each fading beat and wondered how many were left. On the 8th morning, Soren arrived in Thornwood. He rode in on a lathered horse, alone, without escort, which told Eloin everything she needed to know before he said a single word. Abeda did not leave his Alpha's side unless the situation was beyond desperate. She met him in the doorway. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. The composure that defined him was cracked. His pale eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw unshaved, his riding coat streaked with mud. "How bad?" Eloin asked. Soren dismounted and stood before her, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain. 3 episodes in 2 days. The last one lasted 9 hours. He shifted fully and could not shift back. 4 guards were injured, restraining him. Eloin's stomach dropped. "He called your name," Soren said. "During the episode, the wolf called your name. Not growled it, not roared it, called it, like he was searching for you." Her throat closed. "Brienne sent me," Soren continued. "She says the fracture is accelerating. Without your presence, the final severing could happen within days, not months." He paused. "She also says you are dying too. That the incomplete bond is killing you both." "She is not wrong," Eloin said. Soren studied her face. "Will you come back?" "He ordered me to leave." "He ordered you to leave, because he believed he was protecting you. He was wrong." "He knows he was wrong. He has known since the first night without you, when the wolf nearly tore his chambers apart." Eloin leaned against the doorframe because her legs were not reliable anymore. "Did he send you?" Soren hesitated. "He does not know I am here. He would be furious." "Then why?" "Because I have served Theron Vael since we were boys," Soren said, his voice finally cracking. "And I will not watch him die, because he is too proud and too guilt-ridden to ask for help." Eloin closed her eyes. Behind her she heard footsteps. She turned to find Aldrich standing in the hallway. He had heard everything. Their eyes met. She saw the understanding settle over his face, slow and heavy and final. "Go," Aldrich said quietly. "You were never really here, Eloin. Not since you came back." The guilt was enormous. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to offer something that would make this less awful. "Don't," Aldrich said, holding up a hand. "Just go save your king." She rode with Soren through the night. Every mile closer to the palace, the bond grew stronger, and with it came waves of emotion so powerful she had to grip the saddle to stay upright. His pain, his terror, his wolf, howling in a register only she could hear, screaming her name into the dark. They arrived at the palace before dawn. Soren led her through the corridors at a near run. Guards stepped aside without question. Servants pressed against walls. The palace felt wrong, charged with a tension that prickled against her skin, like static before a lightning strike. They stopped outside the door to the king's chambers. 2 guards stood on either side. Both had fresh bandages on their arms. "He has been in and out of episodes since midnight," Soren said. "Brienne sedated him an hour ago, but it will not last long." Eloin pushed open the door. The room was wrecked, furniture overturned. The window shattered, claw marks gouged into the stone walls, deep and savage. And in the center of the destruction, on the bed, Theron lay unconscious, held in place by reinforced leather straps, his face pale and drawn and covered in sweat. Eloin crossed the room and sank to her knees beside the bed. She reached for his hand. The moment her fingers touched his skin, a shudder ran through his body, and the rigid tension in his muscles released like a held breath. His eyes opened, gray, human, devastated. "Of course I came back, you impossible man." His hand turned beneath hers, and his fingers laced through her own and held on with a desperation that told her everything his pride would never allow him to say. "I am sorry," he said, "for sending you away, for thinking I could survive this alone. You are the most stubborn person I have ever met, and I once treated a man who refused to admit he had an arrow in his shoulder." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Then it crumbled. "I hurt people during the episodes, Eloin the guards. I do not remember it afterward, but I see the injuries. I see the fear in their faces." His voice broke. "I am becoming the thing they curse about in stories." "No," she said firmly. "You are becoming the thing the curse wants you to become. There is a difference." She looked at Soren, who stood in the doorway. "Get Briony, now." Bryony arrived within minutes, carrying a leather satchel and an expression that suggested she had been expecting this summons for days. "You were right," Eloin told her, "about everything." Briony knelt on the other side of the bed and examined Theron with quick, practiced hands. "The fracture is severe," she said. 70%, perhaps more. The wolf and the man are barely connected." Theron closed his eyes. "But there is something I discovered while you were gone," Briony continued. "Something that changes what we thought we knew about the curse." She pulled a sheaf of crumbling pages from her satchel. "I found Visara's grimoire, hidden in the Ashenmoor ruins. I sent a team to excavate the site while you were in Thornwood." Soren stepped forward. "What did you find?" Briony laid the pages on the bed. "The curse was not cast after the battle. It was cast during it. Visara activated the curse in the middle of the fighting, before Drekken fell." She looked at Theron. "Your wolf did not lose control, because it is dangerous. It lost control because the curse seized it. The rampage during the final battle, the civilians who died, that was the curse taking hold. Not your wolf, not you. The silence that followed was absolute." Theron's face went blank with shock. "What did you say?" "You have spent over a year believing your wolf betrayed you, that it lost control and killed innocent people because the beast inside you is something monstrous. That guilt has been feeding the curse, widening the fracture, because you believe on some level that you deserve to lose your wolf." Briony's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "But your wolf did not betray you, Theron. It was hijacked. The curse used it as a weapon, and then it used your guilt about what happened to tear you apart from the inside." Theron's hand tightened around Eloin's until her fingers ached. She did not pull away. "All this time," he said, "I thought it was me." Briony left to prepare what she called a stabilizing draft, something to slow the fracture long enough for what came next, though she did not specify what came next. Soren followed her out, pulling the door closed behind him with a quiet click. The room fell silent, just Eloin and Theron, her hand in his, the wreckage of his chambers surrounding them like the aftermath of a war. "You should not have come back," Theron said, but there was no conviction in it. His thumb traced slow circles on her knuckle, a small, unconscious movement that contradicted every word. "You should not have sent me away," Eloin replied. He exhaled, a long, shaking breath that seemed to drain the last of his resistance. "I was trying to protect you, I know. I thought if you were far enough away, the bond would weaken, that you would forget." "Theron." "I collapsed in the Thornwood Infirmary on the 5th day. The healer said my wolf was in severe distress. I could hear your wolf howling through the bond from 2 territories away." She paused. Forgetting was never an option. He turned his head to look at her, and the rawness in his gray eyes made her breath catch. The night you left, I had the worst episode yet. I shifted and could not come back for 3 hours. When I finally did, the study was destroyed. The desk, the bookshelves, the chair you used to sit in, his voice roughened. Your chair. The wolf destroyed everything except your chair. Something wrenched behind her ribs. I sat in the wreckage at 4 in the morning, surrounded by broken wood and shattered glass, staring at that chair in the empty space where you should have been, and I knew I had made the worst decision of my life. He swallowed hard. But I was too proud and too afraid to fix it. Soren fixed it for you, Eowyn said gently. Soren will never let me hear the end of it. Good, you deserve that. A pause. Then quietly, almost too softly to hear, he asked, did you go back to him? To Aldrich? I went back to Thornwood, but I was never going back to Aldrich. I think you know that. Something shifted in his expression, relief, raw and unguarded. He told me to go save my king, Eowyn added. He is a far better man than either of us deserves. Theron was quiet for a moment. When this is over, I will see that he is taken care of. He does not need taking care of. He needs to be left alone to find someone who will love him properly, something I could never have done. Because even before I knew what the bond was, I think some part of me was already yours. The words hung in the air. She had not planned to say them. They had simply arrived, fully formed, like a truth that had been waiting for its moment. Theron pulled her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles. The contact sent warmth flooding through her body, pushing back the cold that had lived in her chest since the carriage ride to Thornwood. I do not deserve you, he said against her skin. Probably not, she agreed. But you are stuck with me, regardless. She felt the bond between them pulse, stronger than it had been in weeks. Demanding, Briani said the bond must be completed, Eowyn said carefully. If the fracture is going to be healed, the mate bond needs to be sealed, fully. Theron's gaze darkened. I know what that means. So do I. And you want this. His voice was rough. Not because of the curse. Not because of the bond pulling you. You want this. Eowyn leaned forward until their foreheads touched. She could feel his breath against her lips, warm and unsteady. She could feel his heartbeat through his hand, rapid and strong. I have wanted this since you left a book about the coast on my chair and pretended you did not know anything about it, she said. I have wanted this since you told me the ocean does not pretend to be calm when it is not. I want this because of who you are, Theron, not what the bond tells me to feel. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was a year of loneliness and terror and desperate restraint breaking open all at once. His hands came up to cradle her face, tilting her head, and she felt the groan that moved through his chest. Before she heard it, she kissed him back with everything she had, every night spent watching firelight on his jaw. Every morning she had lingered too long, every moment of aching, furious, inconvenient, wanting that she had buried so deep she thought it might never surface. He pulled her onto the bed, and she went willingly, her hands reaching for him, needing the closeness the bond had been screaming for since the moment she first touched his hand. What followed was overwhelming and tender and fierce. All at once, his hands trembled when he held her. Her breath caught when he whispered her name against her hair. They fell into each other like two halves of something that had always been meant to be whole. When the moment came, he bit down on the curve of her neck, the mating bite. Instinct and choice fused into one irreversible act. The bond snapped into place with a force that stole her breath, golden and immense and absolutely certain, connecting them at a depth she had not known existed. She bit him back, marked him as hers, felt the bond flare complete. They held each other in the aftermath, breathing hard, his forehead pressed against her shoulder, her fingers in his hair. She could feel everything he felt now, unfiltered, the exhaustion and the relief and the terrified, incredulous joy of a man who had been drowning and finally found air. Sleep, she murmured, running her fingers through his hair. I am right here. He fought it for a few seconds, his arms tightening around her, his breath evening reluctantly. Then he surrendered, and his body went heavy and warm against hers. Eloan closed her eyes. The bond hummed between them, bright and whole. She let sleep take her. She opened her eyes inside the fracture. It was not like before. The previous times she had entered the wolf's consciousness. She had been swept into chaos, into rage and memory and terror. This time the bond carried her in gently, like a river guiding a boat downstream, and set her down in a place that was quiet and vast and utterly, completely wrong. She stood on a plain of ash, gray as far as she could see in every direction, stretching to a horizon that did not exist because the sky was the same color as the ground, a seamless expanse of nothing. The air tasted like iron and old grief. Ahead of her, maybe 50 paces away, stood Theron, not the man she had just left sleeping in a ruined bedroom, a version of him stripped bare of everything that made him a king. No crown, no authority, no armor. He stood in the ash in simple clothes, his hands empty, his expression hollow, and across from him, separated by a chasm that split the ground like a wound, was the wolf. Eloan had never seen his wolf before. She had felt it, sensed it, heard it howling through the bond, but she had never seen it with her own eyes. It was enormous, black-furred and silver-eyed, and built like something that had crawled out of a myth. It stood on the far side of the chasm, its massive head lowered, its body trembling with the effort of staying upright. It was wounded, not physically, but fundamentally, and she could see the curse's damage in the way its edges seemed to blur and fade, like a drawing being slowly erased. The chasm between them pulsed with dark energy. Memories moved inside it, like currents in black water. She could see fragments, the battlefield, smoke and blood, civilians running. The wolf, eyes blazing with amber that was not its own, moving through the chaos with terrible purpose, striking at everything in its path, unable to distinguish ally from enemy, friend from threat. And Theron trapped inside his own mind, screaming at the wolf to stop, knowing it could not hear him because the curse had severed their connection at the worst possible moment. "You see it now," said a voice. Eloan spun. A woman stood behind her in the ash, small, dark-haired. Her face was gaunt and her eyes burned, with a kind of rage that outlives the body that carried it. "Vasara," Eloan said. The ghost smiled. It was not a kind smile. "The bond you sealed brought you here, brave but foolish. You cannot repair what I have broken." "You cursed him during the battle," Eloan said. "Not after. You took control of his wolf and turned it against his own people. And then you let him believe it was his fault." "It was his fault," Vasara replied, her voice cold and ancient. "He brought war to my people. My mate died in his campaign. Every death that followed is a debt he owes. So you made his wolf into a weapon, and then cursed him for the damage it did under your control." Eloan's voice shook with fury. "That is not justice. That is cruelty." "They are the same thing," Vasara said. "Ask anyone who has lost everything." Eloan turned from the ghost and walked toward the chasm. The ash crunched beneath her bare feet. The closer she got, the louder the memories became. Voices screaming, metal clashing. The terrible sound of a wolf howling in confusion and pain, as its mind was ripped away from its other half. Theron stood at the edge. He was staring down into the chasm, his face empty. "I can hear them," he said, without looking at her. "I always hear them. Every person who died that day, every face I could not save." "The wolf did not choose that," Eloan said, stopping beside him. "Vasara controlled it. The curse made your wolf attack those people, and then it used your guilt about what happened to tear you apart." "It does not matter who controlled it," Theron said, his voice flat and dead. "They are still gone." Eloan looked across the chasm at the wolf. It was watching her. Silver eyes, enormous and ancient, and filled with a pain that mirrored the man's, so exactly it split something open inside her. "It matters," she said, "because the wolf has been trying to reach you ever since. It has been on the other side of this chasm since the curse began howling for you, and you cannot hear it because you think it betrayed you. It killed people. Eloin? No. She took his face in her hands and forced him to look at her. The curse killed people through your wolf, against its will. And you have been punishing both of you for something neither of you chose. Tears streaked through the ash on his cheeks. She wiped them away with her thumbs. I was left on the steps of Thornwood as a baby, she said. No name, no family, no explanation. And I spent 23 years believing I was not enough. That if I had been better, different, worth something, my parents would have kept me. Her voice trembled, but held. I made myself useful to everyone around me because I thought that was the only way to earn the right to exist. I thought if I stopped being useful, I would disappear. She pressed her forehead against his. But that was a lie, I told myself, because the truth was too painful. The truth is that what happened to me was not about me at all. It was about them. Their choices, their failings. Not mine. She pulled back and looked into his eyes. What happened on that battlefield was not about you either. It was Visara's choice, Visara's cruelty, not your wolf's nature. Not your failure. You are allowed to put this down. Theron, you are allowed to forgive your wolf. You are allowed to be whole. For a long suspended moment nothing happened. Then Theron turned toward the chasm. He looked at the wolf. His wolf, standing broken and fading on the other side. And the wolf looked back at him with silver eyes that held no anger. No accusation. Only longing. I am sorry, Theron whispered across the divide. I thought you were the enemy, but you were trying to come home. The chasm shuddered. The memories inside it flickered and dimmed. Visara's ghost screamed somewhere behind them, a sound of fury and disbelief. But Eloin did not turn around. Theron stepped off the edge. Eloin longed for him, on instinct, her heart seizing, but he did not fall. The chasm was closing, the walls of memory and guilt drawing together like a wound finally allowed to heal. He walked across it, each step surer than the last, and when he reached the other side, the wolf surged forward and pressed its massive head against his chest. The bond between man and beast reconnected with a sound like a thunderclap. Light exploded outward, golden and fierce, and the ash plane dissolved. The chasm vanished. Visara's curse shattered like glass thrown against stone, and the fragments turned to dust and scattered into nothing. Eloin felt it through the mate bond, felt the fracture heal, felt two halves of the same soul crash back together after an eternity apart. She fell to her knees in the light and wept. Eloin woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm amber light of a room that smelled like cedar, and him. Dawn pressed through the shattered window, painting everything gold. Theron was already awake. He lay on his side facing her, one arm still wrapped around her waist, and he was looking at her the way she had always imagined someone might look at her but never actually believed anyone would. Like she was the coast. Like she was the ocean. Like she was the first honest thing he had ever found. It is gone, he said. His voice was rough from sleep and raw from everything else, but beneath it there was something new. Lightness, space. The voice of a man who could finally breathe. The curse, Eloin asked. The chasm, the guilt, all of it. He lifted his hand and pressed it to his own chest over his heart. The wolf is here, I can feel it, whole. Des. For the first time in over a year, I can feel my own wolf, and it is not fighting me. Eloin's eyes filled. She blinked and the tears spilled over, and she did not care. So, it worked. You worked. He pulled her closer, tucking her against his chest, and his arms tightened around her like he was afraid she might dissolve. You walked into the worst place inside me, and you stayed. You did not run. You did not flinch. I flinched a little, she admitted. He laughed. The sound was broken and beautiful, and it flooded her with a warmth so sudden it stung her eyes. They lay together in the golden light and breathed. The bond hummed between them, steady and complete, a constant low note of connection that she knew she would feel for the rest of her life. What happens now? She asked after a while. Now I introduce my mate to my court formally. Your court is going to hate me. I am a nobody healer from a border pack. I have no family name. I own one dress, and it is borrowed. You are the woman who saved the king's life, Theron said. And anyone who takes issue with that can discuss it with me personally. While your wolf looms behind you looking enormous and terrifying, naturally, she smiled. He smiled back. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him. The kind that reached his eyes, the kind that made him look like the man he must have been before the war, before the curse, before the guilt ate him hollow. She touched his face. Traced the line of his jaw, memorized the way the light caught the gray of his eyes. You owe me a trip to the coast, she said. I do. And a new cushion. The old one is lumpy from being packed in a bag. Done. And a proper wedding, because my last one was rudely interrupted by a very large man with glowing eyes, who said, "Mine," like he was ordering dinner. Theron's ears turned red. In my defense, the wolf said that. I had very little input. You had enough input to stand there staring at me while 200 people held their breath. You were beautiful, he said simply. You were standing at an altar in a borrowed dress, with wildflowers in your hair, and my wolf, who had been at war with me since the day the curse was cast, went completely silent for the first time. I could not have looked away if the hall was burning. Eloan felt something shift inside her, permanent and irreversible, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. I would like the wedding to have considerably fewer interruptions this time, she said. I will issue a royal decree. Can you do that? I am the king, she kissed him. And for the first time, in a very long time, neither of them was afraid. The curse did not leave cleanly. Theron still woke some nights, with his heart pounding and his hands clenched in the sheets. The guilt did not vanish just because he understood where it came from. Grief never works that way. You do not unlearn a year of self-punishment in a single night, no matter how transcendent the night was. But Elowen was there. Every time the dark crept in, she was there. She held him and listened when he needed to talk, and said nothing when he needed quiet, and occasionally told him about the apprentice in Thornwood who had accidentally dyed a patient's entire arm purple because some stories never stop being funny. The court adjusted slowly. A foundling healer as the Alpha Queen was not what anyone had envisioned. The whispers followed her through the corridors for months, but Theron's hand was steady in hers at every public appearance. His wolf, whole and restored, radiated a calm authority that silenced the loudest critics, and gradually, reluctantly, the court accepted what the bond had already decided. 3 months after the curse broke, Theron took her to the coast. They stood on a cliff above the northern sea, wind pulling at her hair, salt on her lips, and Eloan heard the waves for the first time. The ocean crashed against the rocks below, with a sound so enormous and relentless that it made her laugh out loud. You were right, she said, turning to him. It is honest. Theron stood beside her, his hand in hers, his face open and unguarded in a way that still surprised her sometimes. The wind caught his hair, the gray in his eyes reflected the sea. So are you, he said. They stood together on the cliff's edge and listened to the waves, and did not pretend to be calm. They did not need to. They were exactly what they were. Flawed and healing and impossibly stubbornly alive, and that was more than enough. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.